The slim volume by Nikos Kazantzakis, entitled The Saviours of God, might well be regarded as one of the truly seminal works of the 20th century. Responding to the decline in religious engagement that characterized the century, Kazantzakis sought to enunciate a new approach to man's examination of his own spirituality. In this lecture, Howard F. Dossor sets the work in its historic setting and spells out the pathway to a non-religious heightened spirituality that Kazantzakis identified. Howard Dossor, who spent much of his working life in university administration, is a regular lecturer to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, and a set of his lectures on various writings of Kazantzakis are available on YouTube. He is the author of the definitive volume, Colin Wilson, The Man and His Mind. Here is Howard Dossor.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining with me this evening. I'd like to begin proceedings within the pages of the Oxford Shorter Dictionary, and with that publication's definition of the word religion. In fact, the dictionary ascribes no less than 7 legitimate usages of this complex noun, ranging from a bond between man and the gods to recognition on the part of man of some higher unseen power. Although not inclusively prescriptive across the 7 definitions offered, the engagement between man and a higher being seems central to the meaning of the word. If I had the authority to add an 8th statement to express its meaning, I would suggest that religion consists of the extension of a belief into a dogma. Since the notion of dogma suggests an absolute authority, such as a god, this definition might be allowable. The application of dogma to the meaning of religion is useful, for it helps us understand the need religion has for rules and requirements, or, if you will, commandments or articles of faith. Indeed, religion consists, in very large part, in the formulation of catechisms and creeds, which give expression to its dogma, so that compliance with such creeds constitutes the nature of religious behaviour. Further, the authority suggested as being implicit in these creeds leads to the development of exercises or disciplines that enhance compliance with the requirements of the creed. Prayer and acts of worship are 2 such exercises. But here, we might take a closer look at a set of exercises established in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola and published under the title The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. A close examination of Loyola's volume is instructive. Its primary purpose was to inculcate a pattern of behaviour that was in accord with the doctrines of the Society of Jesus. The exercises it propounded focus on an interpretation of the life of Jesus and a requirement not simply that life should be based upon the precepts of Jesus, but that life should be expended in a religious commitment to that historic person as the Son of the living God. Although they became the central doctrine or document in the training of Jesuit novitiates, they were also aimed at the conversion of non-Christians to articles of the faith. Originally designed to be taken over a 30-day period within a dedicated retreat, performance of the exercises was gradually redesigned so that they could be performed over extended periods, eventually becoming the parameters of a lifelong discipline for those who chose to make them such. Since their publication, the exercises have won a measure of popularity outside Catholicism, with many Protestant and other individuals of faith embracing them as useful tools in the expression and further refinement of their beliefs. The Ignatian exercises are divided into 4 weekly sessions, with each session aimed at achieving a specific goal. In the first week, the objective is to reform the deformed, that is, to come to grips with our failure to respond adequately to the love of God. The second week consists of a concentrated attempt to conform the deformed, where the life of Jesus is assessed in order that we might the better respond to him in love and devotion. This prepares the participant for the third week, which seeks to conform the conformed. Here, the crucifixion of Jesus is considered in depth, so that the measure of commitment to him may be intensified. Finally, in the fourth week, the object is to transform the conformed, where transformation consists of a participation in the joy of resurrection and a dedication of the self to the Christian mission. In keeping with general Christian practice, the exercises make intensive use of biblical exegesis, prayer, and meditation. By and large, they are prescribed by the Ignatian theology rather than by philosophical reflection, and they are characterized by the requirement of obedience to a worldview that is beyond dispute and validated exclusively by faith. Clearly, then, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola must be defined as being essentially religious. They posit not simply a God, but a specific God, who allegedly manifested himself to mankind in the person of Jesus, and who offers us redemption from a perverse nature that is intrinsic to us from the moment of our birth, and continues with us until we perform an act of contrition, in response to which we receive divine mercy and access to a heavenly kingdom. Religious exercises and practices, even religion itself, are all under scrutiny in many parts of the world in the present age, which, by way of example, has been designated as being post-Christian. Indeed, for the American poet Hart Crane, the constellation known as the Southern Cross is a powerful symbol for a defunct Christianity. Significantly, however, Hart expresses no nostalgia over the loss of this historic expression of faith, but he does acknowledge the vacuum that its decline creates. Notwithstanding the fact that for millions of people throughout the world, religious faith remains at the centre of their existence and of their personal pattern of living, many others are confronted with the question, with what, if anything, shall we replace religion? The answer to this question that most readily suggests itself to the contemporary sensitive mind, may well be the spiritual. Although human spirituality has historically largely been embedded within the parameters of ecclesiastical authority and has been subjected to a requisite compliance with an imposed dogma and the directives of purportedly sacred writings, many who have foregone a religious faith yet contend that they retain a core of spirituality that grounds their being and identifies them as being authentically human. For many of these spiritual persons, what they designate as being their spirituality finds expression through some form of artistic enterprise. Music, poetry, drama, dance, and all of the fine arts complement their physical existence and transport them into a realm that seems to float above the commonplace. Art itself, many such devotees would argue, may be understood as an articulation of the spirit. Unquestionably, the arts do inspire and do direct our attention to higher things, and they do seem to engage us in spheres that escape time and space. But they seem to play no more than a peripheral part in the life of the common man, and we do not spend every day in a gallery or a theatre. Are the arts any more than a diverting entertainment that give us temporary release from the constraints of oppressing reality? Whatever their nature, however, it is clear that the arts belong firmly within the existential reality that we call life. Indeed, as the American novelist James Baldwin pointed out, art would not be important if life were not important, and life is important. Others, the non-artists among the non-religious, might contend that they exude spirituality through their vocation or through a lifetime of devoted service in addressing the needs of less fortunate members of their community. But for the majority, vocation, or the employment in which they find themselves engaged, seems quotidian and somewhat removed from the lofty realm of high ideals, no matter how much we might rationalise them as being of absolute worth. Work constitutes a particular manifestation of life itself. The arts, together with work, no matter how much spirituality we may contend them to express, are simply forms of behaviour that flow out of life. Perhaps then, there is some need for us to pause here and ask, just as we asked for a definition of religion, for a definition of spirituality. Just what is it that is being enshrined in this mysterious word? Again, we turn to the shorter Oxford Dictionary and to the root word of spiritual, which is spirit. And again, we find a multiplicity of definitions, no less than 4 being offered. Spirit may be a supernatural being normally imperceptible to human senses, or again, spirit is the soul of a person. But primarily, spirit is the animating or vital principle in man and animals that gives life to the physical organism. But it is in its derivation that the dictionary takes us closest to the meaning of the word spirit. It comes to us from the Latin word spirare, which means breathing. Given this derivation and this definition, there seems to be some justification for understanding the spiritual to be identical with life itself. Spirit is life, as life is spirit. That which surges through us and through every living thing is untouchable, unseeable, and incomprehensible to our intellect. Call it spirit if you will, but the more common, more communicable meaning is conveyed through the word life. Where words such as soul, spirit, and spirituality confuse and divide opinion, the word life offers cohesion and comprehension. Although life constitutes the highest value we know empirically, we pay more attention to it implicitly than explicitly. We live it, but we do not allow its intrinsic value to impinge upon our thinking very often. We associate it primarily with our own individuality, and we pay scarce attention to it as a pulsating vital energy pervading everything and separating us from the abyss out of which it has enabled us to emerge. We take life for granted and hide its incalculable value behind materialistic standards and within unexamined objectives. In truth, we care more for our own beating heart than about the energy that pounds throughout the cosmos and of which our being is but a part. We pay lip service to spirit, but we fail to recognise that what underlies spirit is life itself. Ralph Waldo Emerson recognised this and sought to remediate it in his assertion that nothing is secure but life, transition, the energising spirit. It is, I am persuaded, within the context of all that we have noted here, that the writings of the Cretan poet, novelist and philosopher Nikos Kazantzakis are best to be understood, because it is his unique contribution to Western thought that he has emphasised the relationship between the individual and life. He has set each of us within a network of expanding relationships that enhance not only our individuality, but the ongoing thrust of life itself. Further, he has devised a set of exercises, a blueprint for thinking and behaviour that facilitate these outcomes. Before turning to examine Kazantzakis' exercise in detail, it might be useful to consider some background material that supports our argument. To this end, we turn to the slim volume that best enunciates his philosophy and gives poetic expression to his existential and humanistic vision. The first feature of the work we note is its very title. When he originally published it in a periodical in 1927, Kazantzakis gave it the title Salvatoris Dei Askitiki, the first part being the title, while the second part served as a subtitle. The use of Latin in the first part may be an indication that he had in mind the work of Ignatius, and was deliberately offering his own exercises as an alternative to them. As this part of the title suggests, the volume does contain a reference to man as being the saviour of God, but it is highly significant that when he published a revised version in book form in 1945, he reversed the title and subtitle so that it became Askitiki Salvatoris Dei. This amendment suggests that he wished to shift the emphasis from a focus on the relationship between man and God to the nature of man and his ongoing development. In his introduction to the translation of the Odyssey, a modern sequel, Gimon Fryer points out that Kazantzakis, just prior to commencing work on that epic work, had completed a small volume that, in Fryer's view, would best be titled The Saviours of God, with the words spiritual exercises being added as a subtitle. Significantly, when he came to translate that small volume itself into English, that is the title and subtitle he gave it. We might wish he had observed Kazantzakis' amendment. An attempt to discover how and why the Greek word askitiki was rendered into English as spiritual exercises has been unsuccessful. The Greek word ascesis does not appear in the shorter Oxford or the Random House dictionaries, but it is to be found in online dictionaries as an English neologism. It is offered here as a possible better translation of askitiki, because it captures more closely what we contend was Kazantzakis' intention when he selected his title. Deriving from the Greek askein, to exercise, ascesis bears the notion of discipline, and although it can be used in a religious context, its primary sense is of self-discipline, of personal training to attain a given standard, as in the self-discipline an athlete must employ in preparation for competition. Walter Pater finds in it the sense of girding up the loins. We may interpret ascesis as expressing Kazantzakis' challenge to mankind to equip itself to accord with the broader nature of life, rather than with the requirements of a divine being or of perceived individual self-interest. In an extended assessment of Askitiki in his two-volume Kazantzakis, The Politics of the Spirit, the preeminent Kazantzakian scholar Peter Behan recognises that it may be interpreted from a variety of different perspectives. On the one hand, he writes that religiously, Askitiki is a gospel, good news, containing a theology, a method of initiation into a knowledge of God, and a prescription for behaviour. In other words, it contains a doctrine, a ritual, and a morality. And like other gospels, it is meant to be spread. On the other hand, Bien contends that it might be read philosophically, from which perspective it may be described as a lyrical exposition of subjectivism. The subjectivist bias is confirmed in a subsequent novel, The Rock Garden, where Kazantzakis defines the Askitikis as he who masters the rebellious forces of nature and gives them a form decreed by the mind. We observe that here, in Ben's comments, there is no reference to an other world. Man is confronted with the task of defining his place in this world. On an earlier page of his book, Ben had defined or identified Askitiki as the book in which Kazantzakis eventually attempted to expound his Bergsonian ideas with Nietzschean radiance. Clearly, our interpretation of the work will depend upon the perspective we bring to it, whether we read it religiously or philosophically. Significantly, Ben, in addition to identifying a religious and philosophical dimension to Askitiki, also finds it has a political reference. He argues that the work was written as an intrinsic component of Kazantzakis' attempt to evaluate the significance of the emergent communist movement that preoccupied so many minds throughout the 1920s. Ben sees the writing as a part of the development of the notion that Kazantzakis called meta-communism, and which Ben understands as being a theology of activism, justifying the destruction of capitalism's decadent remains in the interests not so much of economic or social justice, materialistic progress, as of a vital inwardness, higher in the spiritual scale than either capitalism or communism. Ben's assessment of Kazantzakis' political interests must be interpreted with due regard to what Ben himself acknowledges in the subtitle of his work, that to the extent that Kazantzakis was interested in politics, it was in the politics of the spirit. Politics, for Kazantzakis, transcended any particular theological, philosophical, or sociological ism or ology. His political concerns were directed at creating a cosmic harmony that had at its centre the cohesive force that we call life. We might symbolise it as the citadel of life, as distinct from St. Augustine's city of God. Given Ben's enthusiasm for a process theology promoted by Darren Middleton in such works as Novel Theology and God's Struggler, one might conclude that he reads Kazantzakis with a sharp eye to his theological significance. Undoubtedly, this is the approach of Middleton, an ordained Baptist minister and professor of religion at Texas Christian University. In a jointly authored paper in God's Struggler, Ben and Middleton boldly assert, assuredly, Kazantzakis' witness lies within the boundaries of a biblical faith. We might also note that in his work Kazantzakis and God, Daniel Dombrowski deals with classical and modern features of theological discourse, as if Kazantzakis' major contribution is to be understood within the parameters of that discourse. All these writers seem to ignore Kimon Fryer's insistence that Kazantzakis stands outside all religious dogmas, and that it was his desire to replace the Christian notion of God with an understanding of the evolutionary drive as a thrust for spiritual refinement, or, as we might say, the enhancement of life. The work Askitiki is a difficult work to classify in terms of its format. It is not a simple narrative in prose form, nor is it recognisable as a poem, although it is infused with the lyrical and metaphoric language one associates with poetry. We have noted that Bion has referred to it as a gospel, and if we could divest that word of its religious connotations and apply it as the name of a literary genre, representing nothing more than the promulgation of good news, then it might indeed serve as a class into which Askitiki aptly fits. Certainly, the book is a document that contains good news. Its primary function, however, is to offer insight into the human predicament, and perhaps we should content ourselves with that description rather than seek a category for it. The work comprises 456 verses. It would not be inappropriate to substitute the word aphorisms for the word verses. These are distributed across 4 books, which are located between a 30-line prologue and a 29-verse postlude, which culminates in a beautiful celebration of wholeness. In the prologue, Kazantzakis sets down his broad overview of the situation in which the species man finds himself. In particular, he identifies the creative and destructive forces that permeate our experience and asserts that our initial task lies in encompassing that dichotomy and utilising it in the exercise of living. Just as we cannot deny the reality of our existence, so we must not attempt to deny the incomprehensible mystery that holds us within its grasp. The unnamed author of the article on Askitiki in Wikipedia refers to the prologue as an admonition, insofar as an admonition urges, the word fits. Kazantzakis urges us to admit actuality and divest ourselves of the myths and legends with which we seek to placate our fears and other discomforts. The advice he proffers relates to the nature of the reality in which we have our existence. We, each one of us, he reminds us, comes from a dark abyss and ends in a dark abyss. And we ignore or contradict this fact only at the loss of our comprehension. The first of the 4 books is called The Preparation, and in it, Kazantzakis sets out 3 duties which must be performed. Our first duty is to accept the limitations of our minds, the restrictions on human capacity. But, in an apparent paradox, the second duty is a direct contradiction of the first. It is to deny all boundaries and recognise that our potential is unlimited. How is this possible? Kazantzakis argues that it becomes possible when individuality is subsumed within the totality of the species. United, with hearts merged, we cannot simply endure, but can engage in a continuous creation. Life is not limited to the individual. In this context, we must embrace the third duty, and that is to relinquish all hope for a perpetual individual presence. Caught up in life's creative and destructive cycle, we are, each of us, subject to death. Of these three duties, Kazantzakis was able to say of himself that he had accomplished them, and he was thus able to write, "I hold no hope for anything. My heart and mind have escaped from hope and have attained freedom. I have surmounted hope, climbed above it. The freedom I have achieved is greater than hope." But successful performance of these three duties simply places us at the beginning of a long journey, a journey which Kazantzakis outlines in the volume's second book, which he entitles The March. In order that we might the better comprehend it, he reduced it to 4 steps, setting them out in a precise regimen. On the first step, we confront our own ego, the self we have erroneously heretofore thought to be both the centre of and the meaning underlying reality. We reassess our own significance within the order of things. We acknowledge that the universe does not revolve around our perception of it, and consequent upon this acknowledgement, we hear deep within us the fearful cry of a frightened child. We admit our sense of dread. But then, as if shuffling feet to regain balance, we affirm another recognition. We realise that we are not without real significance. We can transcend our fears. We act, we think, we create. And so, in coming to terms with these dual aspects of our own identity, we accept the self as it really is, all masks removed, all camouflage dissolved. We are a coalescence of the agony and the ecstasy. Empowered, rather than enervated by this realisation, our foot rises beneath us as we move to take the second step. In advance now of an impoverished ego, we encounter the race. We were not born in a vacuum, and our tribe is about us at birth. The cry we hear within our hearts is not our cry alone. It is a chorus of cries, and it issues forth not simply in numerical strength, but in a common urgency. Within the trembling of that cry, our forefathers plead with us to finish the work they commenced, and our unborn children seek of us the foundation upon which they might apply their own advanced creative skills. Thus, we have no exclusive right to our individual accomplishments. They are the product of a united effort, and they belong to all. To engage with our race is to comprehend that everything we do in common, and that all our activity, even the smallest act, reverberates through the generations. The third step immeasurably broadens our engagement with our fellow men, for now, where before we saw our race, we now see mankind, the mankind within which we have our identity and to which we are linked in an unbreakable bond. Thus, the dead rise from their graves and dwell within us, and the mother sees beyond her husband to her son as a new extension of the human into the future. We are not simply an ego within a body. We are in, of, and for each other in a united effort to affirm life over against the abyss. There is a fourth, final step. It constitutes an embrace of the earth itself, our home in the vast expanses of space. Yet it is more than an embrace. It is an absolute embedment, an identification of the self with the earth, a wedding of the species and the planet, for the planet itself, with its rocks and its rivers, its plants and its plateaus, also finds a voice in our cry. The globe that feeds and sustains us is a part of our march, as it too seeks to retain a shape that defies the nothingness that threatens to unshape everything. Such a march, such a momentous undertaking, is unlikely to be undertaken successfully unless there is some kind of incentive that encourages us to participate. We understand that where there is no vision, the people perish. Kazantzakis also knew this, and he therefore names the third book of Askitiki the vision. And he provides a symbol for this vision. He portrays it as an ascent, and it is undoubtedly the central concept in the whole of his work. There are those men and women who seek a towering peak of Mount Everest, feeling their heart leap and realising that there is present within themselves from their birth an irrepressible need to attain the peak of what lies before them. This is the spirit of Kazantzakis' ascent. But more is involved here than simply climbing a mountain. Kazantzakis himself explains, "It is in this determined climbing, which must always be made more difficult by the descending forces, that brings us so much pain in our lives. But pain does not rule us. Every successful moment we experience on our ascent, even those moments when we are forced to pause in order to regain our breath or establish our foothold, is a moment of joy. And every joy is like a breath that enlivens, gives birth, creates something new. And so the ascent can resume, pain and joy in an unceasing alteration. Yes, unceasing. And we should also understand this. The ascent is an ever-rising, broadening spiral that enfolds, unfolds, enfolds in a ceaseless creative thrust. If a man engages in the march, takes the 4 steps under the inspiration of the vision, what results may we expect to follow? This is the question Kazantzakis addresses in his 4th book, which he calls The Action. He details the results as taking place in 3 critical relationships in which human beings engage. These relationships are between man and God, man and man and nature. It is in his writings with respect to the first of these 3 relationships between man and God that the most vigorous disputation over Kazantzakis' philosophy has been conducted since his death. Is he engaged in a revision of religious belief, or is he discarding it? Resolution of the controversy might be found in a crucial passage he wrote. "I place no value on the image other people and times have constructed to represent the vast mysterious essence. Their image has been largely a mirror of the human, with notions of rewards and sanctions, and with a claim to infallible knowledge. But this image simply reflects their fears and their need for a sense of order to justify their continuance in life. Kazantzakis does not seek to modify the theological images held by others. With Nietzsche, he simply rejects them. But he does not thereby create a vacuum. Following Bergson, he acknowledges the elan vital, the thrust of life into the void, and identifies man as a fundamental feature of that thrust. He does not deify life. Rather, he simply celebrates it as the highest value knowable to man, as a pulsating energy operating beyond time and space in which we participate experientially between our individual birth and death, but from which we can never be isolated. But he also recognises that this life is not beyond danger. It is fragile, and he contends profoundly in need of a human effort to protect it. The essence of life is its struggle for freedom from the void that would destroy it, and humanity offers, through its participation, elements of a way forward. It is in this sense, and in this sense alone, that he can speak of us as being saviours of God. These considerations, it is contended, suggest that Kazantzakis assesses our alleged religious relationship with God as being a man-made concept that interferes with our perception of our relationship with life. In treating the interaction between man and man, Kazantzakis contends that among its objectives should be the creation of beauty out of what he calls the dunghill of our flesh. In a real sense, flesh will forever constitute a dunghill, for it will always remain a tangible form of the intangible reality that is life. And life will always stretch before us, offering new horizons, new possibilities, new identities. Life transcends matter. It is the articulation of beauty through the creation of the new. Kazantzakis is aware that there are multiple pathways that lead in the direction of individual freedom, but individual freedom alone will not ensure a capacity for life to pursue its trajectory through chaos. That task requires a community consciousness, a collective brotherhood, and a unity of purpose. In this context, where one fails, all fail. But where one succeeds, all succeed, and a new doorway is opened for the advance of life. And thus, the role of the individual is not to be underrated. The all is comprised of the every, so that what one achieves, all achieve. Nature, as Kazantzakis understood it, is the platform, the environment within which life struggles to retain its identity and pursue its own continuance. Observation of nature reveals that it too maintains an essential rhythm, a balance between creation and destruction, dormancy in winter, renewal in spring, night and day, life and death. Man himself is an inseparable part of it. He is its consciousness. His mind is not alone within his body. It is in the plants, the sea, the stones. He observes the rise and the fall, the old and the new. And this observation places him under an obligation. He must embrace nature, sustain its rhythm, and utilise its constituent elements in the service of life. In a beautiful image, Kazantzakis speaks of freeing the spirit from a stone by giving it life as a constituent part of the wall of a building. It is thus that life advances. Several years after its initial publication, Kazantzakis produced additional text for Askitiki. This new material included the section that we now regard as a postlude. He called it the silence. The silence, he explains, is that state into which all individuals enter when they have lived out their lives. It is a state of ripeness, of fulfilment. It is silent because for the individual there is nothing more to be accomplished. He ceases to be and becomes merged with the absolutely real. He sinks deeply into the abyss like a seed in the uterus of a woman, and there he remains forever. He settles as a part of the fruitfulness of the womb, a promise, as it were, that the womb will produce anew, that new life will be created, that life will continue on its upward surge. The silence is the perfect, pulsating enunciation of all that cannot be said in words or even in the thought of man. It is this silence that provides Kazantzakis with a poetic image that draws Askitiki to a close. It is an image that for many of his readers represents the most enigmatic of all his writings, but which for many others profoundly resolves the dilemma of death. In it, Kazantzakis draws a crucial distinction between all that exists and all that lies beyond existence, between that which has form and that which is without form. It is the difference between life as we experience it individually and life as it is an indefinable mystery pervading the cosmos. It is a recognition that life persists beyond time and space, beyond existence. Death represents the return of the individual, devoid of his separate consciousness, to the broader reaches of life. It is a reunion with the whole out of which we came and from which we can never be separated. When Kazantzakis insists that the primary responsibility of mankind lies in the transmutation of matter into spirit, he is pointing out that our task lies in aligning ourselves more and more consciously with the authenticity that is life itself. When he speaks of the life force, we might safely discard the second syllable and settle on the word life as designating his central concern. Life, as defined by Nikos Kazantzakis, is the procreative urge of the universe, and man, individually and collectively, existentially and essentially, is an intrinsic part of it. Thank you very much.